Okay, so now we're on to the third session of Traditions of Christmas and History of Christmas. And on this one, I'm going to kind of go back and tell you about how God introduced this to us. And again, if I was to tell you something that was real important to me, I would, if I said, who I'm married to and my wife is real important to me, and I mentioned her very sparingly, my wife, Nancy, Babes, I call her, not bride. If I mentioned her very sparingly, I would think you would question, well, then how, you say it was like the ultimate priority of your importance of your life, physically speaking. Spiritually, it's the Lord of my life first and foremost, and then it's my wife second. But if I said that but don't live that way, doesn't that be confounding? Wouldn't that be inconsistent? Wouldn't that be hypocritical? Well, sure it would. Well, in mankind, that's how we do things. We think in ways God says in the Bible, my ways are not your ways, your thoughts are not your thoughts. And yet we hear that and we see that, we don't understand what that really means. We associate it with, oh, I have cancer, therefore God has a plan. His thoughts are not my thoughts. His ways are not my ways. Oh, I got injured and I lost my job, or this bad thing happened to me, or this weird thing over here is happening to someone I love and care about, and that's okay. God's thoughts are not my thoughts, and my ways are not his ways. It doesn't just mean that, okay? What it means is the way we think, the way we filter, the way we perceive things is always wrong when put against how God sees it, how God filters it, how God ordained and decreed it all. Let me give you an example. Did you know that in the Bible, and you go to the Old Testament, God does not mention much at all about his prophecy of Christmas that much at all. He mentions it very little, and yet when he does mention it, it's very sparse and in between. You're talking about 5000 BC in Genesis 3:15. God begins to say, okay, there's going to be the serpent, talking to the serpent. He's going to strike your heel, and you're going to crush his head. Okay. No mention of, he says that seed of the woman, so there's a child involved, but there's no reference to that being Jesus. He didn't say Yeshua. He didn't say that. He didn't say Savior. He didn't say I myself. He didn't say that. He just said seed of the woman. It's the first, what they call proto-evangelum. So the history of Christmas, if you will, is the origination of how did God prophesy, how did God foretell that he was going to come to this earth. Well, the first time he mentioned anything about even remotely close to that was Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelum, when he said again to the serpent that his seed and her seed, meaning the woman had a seed, a child, and so did Satan, by the way. And so then he was going to crush his head, Jesus. The seed of the woman was, which we know later on would be Jesus, but the seed of the serpent, which was the crafty way of the Satan possessing the serpent, which was a dragon, which was, again, his name known later on in Revelation. Satan is called a dragon, because the word serpent is used more loosely, not to say snake, but a serpent, which is a reptilian, which would include all the aspects of the reptilian kingdom, which is, again, how he did this in Genesis 3:15, which was, again, in 5000 BC. But yet you see that all of a sudden later on, God goes silent on the issue for over 2,000 years. So 2,000 years goes by, over 2,100 years goes by, and God doesn't mention a thing about the coming of the Messiah. Zero. So it's so important that our minds would go, I would say it all the time. I'd repeat it, and I repeat it, and I repeat it, and I repeat it, and they're not God. God is trusting. He wants us to, I should say, God is wanting us to trust him and his word, that we should determine. He wants us to determine based on who he is and what he's already said and who he already is in our lives, to recognize we shouldn't have to hang on him reminding us. We should take emphasis in what he says, so that we should be ruminating through this time. So 2,000 years, many generations, didn't hear nothing. Zero. Nada. Thing from God about the coming of the Messiah, until all of a sudden Jacob's now blessing his sons. And he mentions that, hey, it's going to be, a good 2,000 years later, I'm going to remind you now of the fact that the Shiloh will not depart from Judah. And okay, so I'm going to have a king and a ruler from Judah. You give us that information. So first you tell us that it's a strike his heel, and he's going to crush the head of the seed of the serpent. Okay, I get this. And then you tell me he's going to be the tribe of Judah and the king, but you're 2,000 years apart in these different demarcations. How am I supposed to interpolate that? I'm supposed to remember this. Then as you go on further on, you see then later on, then he mentions again in the book of Numbers that God's going to say, okay, well, I'm going to actually now tell you that 400 years later, he then mentions to Moses that, hey, I'm going to have a star rise up. Okay, that's great. That he also says a greater prophet than Moses. Okay, so you got a reference of the Messiah being born in Genesis, the beginning in chapter 3. Then in chapter 49 to Jacob, a good 2,000 years apart. Then, by the way, no one was told to record that information. Moses wrote that information a good 4,000 years or 3,500 years after it already had happened. He's writing it down. No one wrote the information down. They didn't write it down. They were told it. But later on, when Moses was told to write it down, a good 3,500 years later, he wrote down what God had said, that the first time he mentioned a coming of the Messiah in a rough generalization, Genesis 3:15. Again, theologians call it the proto-evangelium. Then, Genesis 49, Jacob mentions his blessings to his sons, and he mentions that the tribe of Judah, there'd be a Shiloh, out of Shiloh would not the scepter depart, and it would be a king rising from Judah. This is where the Messiah would come from. So we get a good 2,000 years later after that is when he tells them that. And then you got 400 years after that, he tells Moses that there'll be a star that rises up in his time, and there'll be a prophet greater than him. In Numbers, chapter 24 and Deuteronomy 18, there'd be these things told. And then all of a sudden, he goes dark again till another, a good number of years goes by. You know, another 700 years goes by. Look at this gap in time. 2,000 years goes by before he mentions about them becoming the Messiah, and that Messiah being of the tribe of Judah and a king. Another 400 years goes by before he mentions that seed of a woman who's going to be the king and ruler of Judah is going to be a star of rising, and it's going to be a prophet greater than Moses. So you got a good span there of a lot of time being exhausted, and there's only 4 mentionings over the period of time of over 3,000 years. 4 mentions of the Messiah coming. And yet you're telling me my ways are God's ways? I'd be repeating it every day. I'd make you say it as a prayer every day, Jack. Not God. God just mentions it as an outlier, leaves it there, wants us to ruminate on it, wants us to think about it. It's pretty powerful stuff, the history of Christmas. The history of this is God entrusting us with his truth, entrusting us with who he is, and wanting us to value what matters to him most should matter to us most. But in fact, he wants to show us that it doesn't work that way, does it? We, just like when you say, oh, I love my husband or my wife, I love my children, but you don't tell them, why wouldn't you tell them? That makes no sense, right? You should be telling them all the time, right? Because you do. And yet, God, he gives us this truth, and yet he wants us to show him. We're expecting him to tell us. And he's like, no, the fact that I spoke at all to you should mean a lot to you. You should hang on every word I say, because Jesus said that man shouldn't live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And yet we didn't do that. He wants to show us over a 3,000 plus year period of time, even though God only told us 4 times in that period, different progressive information about becoming the Messiah. We didn't hold on to it tightly. Here we are now in AD 700, BC 700 BC. Then he tells Isaiah about how now, not only for the first time, he gets into the specific nature of this seed of a woman, not just being a man born of a woman, but he goes into the specific nature of it being a child, a baby, a literal human growth in the womb, birthed out of the womb. So you could think of seed of the woman can mean, just maybe it's a different kind of supernatural birth. I don't know. But he makes it clear it's not supernatural birth in the sense of there's still a gestation. He was supernatural, immaculate conception, supernatural, Holy Spirit overcame Mary. But we didn't know for certain that Jesus meant that. When God meant that, he said about the person of Jesus, Yeshua, being in the womb, being a regular fetus trimester like we have. We didn't know he meant that until he finally says a virgin will conceive. You're like, what? So wait. So he tells them that in 700 BC, roughly, to Isaiah. And you're like, okay. Then he tells you this virgin is going to give birth, and he says this baby born is going to be everlasting or eternal Father, mighty God, Prince of Peace, wonderful Counselor, God with us, Emmanuel, Isaiah 7, Isaiah 9. You're like, what? Then he goes over to Micah a good couple hundred years later again, and he tells Micah, unto you, lowly Bethlehem, will be born Jesus, Yeshua. That's amazing. And then after that, he goes through Daniel. About another couple of years later, less than about 60 years later, roughly, he tells Daniel that the Messiah is going to be cut off. You're like, cut off? Then another maybe a couple of years in between there, he tells Zechariah that the Messiah is going to come lowly on a colt and a donkey into Jerusalem triumphantly and subdue the government. You're like, okay, I'm confused here. So let's review the tell the tape of the history of Christmas, history of prophetic timeline prior to the birth of Christ, which was in 2 BC. 2 BC. Let's go back to this time. So here he goes, God in the Garden of Eden. He tells the man and the woman in Genesis 3:15 that the seed of the serpent's going to strike his heel and he's going to crush his head. Okay, it's kind of not really mentioning Messiah directly, but you kind of put that together in retrospect that that's what that's talking about. Later on, Genesis chapter 49, 2,000 plus years later, he tells Jacob, who he had changed his name from Jacob to Israel, and he has sons born of him. And he tells his son, pulled aside Judah, and tells him that the shadow will not depart from you, the scepter, and there is to be a ruler from him. You're like, okay, interesting. So this seed of a woman is now being married up to this tribe of kings in Judah in a rulership. Like, interesting. Okay. Then all of a sudden from there, we go a little fast forward longer, 400 years again, then go by. Then Moses, who wasn't even alive during both of those things, he's now from 5000 BC writing back what happened then, and 1400 BC roughly, he's writing about what happened that many years ago, and he's writing about those two events. And he also adds another prophetic statement that God tells him in Numbers, and that's in Numbers again 24 and in Deuteronomy 18 about the star rising up, and also about how this will be a prophet greater than him. So God's adding on to the progressive revelation of his coming of the Messiah, of a seed of a woman, of the tribe of Judah as a ruler, as a king, as actually a star rising up, and as a prophet greater than Moses. There's 4 different things. Then he goes into Isaiah 7 and 9 and tells you now, after 700 years after that, he tells them, oh, by the way, I want you to understand that this virgin will be the one bearing forth this child. Then you're putting it together. You mean the gestation cycle like a average human being? Well, that's weird. That's weird. Okay. And then what's this child going to be called? Emmanuel, God with us? What? And he'll be a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, Prince of Peace, everlasting, eternal Father. That's God in the flesh. Oh, my goodness. Then a good 100 years after that, he tells Micah it's in Bethlehem. God's adding meat on the bones in these latter parts of BC, 700 BC. Now he tells you more specifically. The first 4 prophecies are more vague in general. Now he gets more specific in the last 4 that a virgin, not just any woman, a virgin. And about this any child, God with us. Okay. And not just any God with us. I want you to know, it's not, as our Jehovah's Witness friends want to say, oh, mighty God, small g. No, the only God there ever is and was, ever will, shall be. He's that God, the eternal Father, everlasting Father. What? And not just any city of Jerusalem. No, Bethlehem, lowly Bethlehem. What? Then Daniel adds on to that, oh, by the way, the Messiah's going to be cut off. He tells us that 100 years after that. Cut off? I'm still trying to wrap my mind around why you didn't emphasize this more. It's been over thousands of years, and you've only mentioned four mentionings in 3,000 years, and now the last couple hundred years, you're adding on some more details, but you're not giving us much. Now you talk about in Daniel that he's going to be cut off. What's happening? Then in Zechariah, he talks about he's coming in on a donkey and a colt triumphantly, our Palm Sunday. And you're like, what is going on? So when you think about the Jewish people, you think about how did they not know? Would you know? Those generations that heard these 4 prophecies from Genesis to Numbers, Deuteronomy, those 4, there's 2 in Genesis 3, Genesis 49, Numbers 24, Deuteronomy 18. Those 4 prophecies were done over a 3,000 year period. The last 4 prophecies from Isaiah 7 and 9, Micah 2, then you have also in Daniel 9, Zechariah 9. You have things involved in there that cover over 300 years. And yet we have a concept of thought that, oh, they're ignorant. No. That's like me asking you to remember your great-great-great-grandmother and grandfather's family recipe for something when you never met them. You remembering their names. I never met my grandparents. Imagine having to remember your great-great-grandparents' likes and dislikes in every detail in every way. Or something that you can remember. I don't know many people that know their great-great-grandparents. But we're talking about this is how generations had to then pass this forward. This is how God's expecting a lot of us to put emphasis on him and his word. That's the takeaway from how God spaced out these prophecies and how God then progressively reveals. He wants us to pay attention. He wants us to meditate and ruminate and repeat it. So it's always in the front of our mind. And that's what Christmas is supposed to be about. That's the tradition God taught us to remember. Keep it front of mind. Keep God in the attention and focus, not mankind.